Hi, this is Sunil Bhartia, and welcome to another episode of TFR Insights. And today we have with us Anurag Goyal, founder and CEO of Render. Anurag, first of all, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk about Render because what you're doing there is quite unique. So what I want to understand is, let's just walk back in time, that what problem that you saw at that time that you wanted to solve and you created Render.
When I left Stripe in 2016, I was there for about 5 years, and I joined when there were 8 or so people. I was the 8th employee there, and this was pre-launch, and then saw the company grow to about over 400 people, and just a lot of crazy growth in general in terms of traffic, and all that was great. But we had a massive DevOps team that was managing all these servers on AWS at the time. And the developers didn't really have much insight into any of that. And there was always some sort of like back and forth happening between developers and DevOps people on how to best deploy websites, how to make sure that we're not breaking anything. And then after I left, I was thinking about what to do next. And as part of that, I delved into a lot of different domains. I looked at healthcare, I looked at real-time communications, I looked at deep learning AI, which was actually pretty hot these days, hotter than it is now, I'd say in late 2016. And for all of those domains, I was building small projects, in some cases big projects, and deploying them online. And I was using tools like Heroku, I was using tools like AWS, Google Cloud. And every time I deployed these things, deployed my projects, and for every new project, I had to follow the same set of error-prone steps over and over again. And it felt like I was wasting a lot of time just deploying things online versus actually focusing on my application. And I was doing this all by myself, so I didn't have a massive DevOps team. And as part of that, I realized that, look, in this era of Docker and Kubernetes and all applications being packaged as containers, there has to be a better way to prevent companies from repeating the same thing within each company when it comes to deployment. And that's how Render started.
And what has been even more incredible is the growth of Render. It has been used in political campaign. It has been used by Stripe and all those things. So talk about that because you kind of identified a problem that most people were facing, and suddenly you're offering a solution. So talk about this growth, this trend. What was the primary driver?
I believe that the problem that I saw was obviously not unique to me. As an engineer, I was seeing these problems in deployment, and I built a solution that would appeal to me initially. And all my friends were facing these problems too. And when they were trying to deploy simple things online, or even more complex things online, they were running into the same problems. So in many ways, I decided to do this because I felt like this was a problem that many people were facing, but no one was taking on because it felt too big in a way to take on. You don't build a whole cloud platform from scratch. Well, very few people do. And so that is kind of why, first of all, people sort of saw this as the spiritual successor to something like Heroku, which is more of like a legacy cloud at this point. Salesforce bought it back in 2012 or so, and Heroku hasn't really innovated. So a lot of the growth has been driven by all the new features that Render brings to the table, while being at a cost-effective price point. And then we're also seeing just our users telling each other about Render on Twitter. Every day there is a tweet or two about someone posting about how they hadn't heard of Render before, but it's really cool and they want to tell the world about it. So that has been really the driver of our growth so far. And we're hoping that we can continue to make things easier and easier and add more features to the platform. So extremely complex apps can continue to scale on Render.
And how do you kind of compare to other cloud providers where you offer some additional like an edge which your customers get versus your competitors?
I'd say our biggest edge is UX, and it comes to making simple things really, really easy, but also making harder things that are more complex possible and easy and intuitive in the same way that you would expect from, say, an Apple product. So to give you an example, everyone has this notion of VPCs, right? We all know just instinctively that configuring a VPC is painful, and you need to understand how to create these services that can talk to each other. You need to set up service discovery. Oh, maybe I should use something like Consul. And then within Kubernetes, I need to spin up a cluster, manage it. All of that is completely transparent to the user in Render. We just have a private network by default. We don't claim to have some VPC product. It's just, you can run a private service. It's only visible to services within your network. And we give you a URL for your service automatically with a host and a port, and you can have multiple ports open, and you don't have to configure a VPC because it's there. So I think that it's that ease of use, the intuitive deployment options that we're giving our users that make it, I'd say, better than other providers for a lot of things. Not everything. We don't have, we're a relatively new platform. We don't have, for example, manage MySQL as a service yet, but we'll get there.
The way the industry is kind of evolving, the use cases are also kind of evolving. Customers are also demanding more. How do you, first of all, keep up with all of that? At the same time, not only keeping up with that, also try to bring all of those to your customer base?
That's a great question. First of all, how do we keep up with all of that? Just the same way you're keeping up with it. I think reading everything we can on highly technical publications like yours, and then also keeping track of open source releases and making sure that we're continuing to talk to our users. I think that's the biggest thing. And we have an open Slack community for not just our users, anyone can join. And people ask us about these things in that community where they're trying to use Render in ways that we never anticipated. And so that is the user feedback and the user conversation. It's not just a feedback, it's always conversations where we try to really understand what they're trying to do and then evolve our product accordingly. So for example, when Render first launched, we did not have static sites. Partly because there were a ton of static site providers out there, and we wanted to focus on making the backend easier. And apps, so one example of evolution is that apps are being built in these two halves, where you have a static front end. And by static, I mean, I'm sure as you know, what I really mean is just something that can be served over a CDN. It's HTML, JavaScript, and the app itself is a single page app. But then the app talks to the second half, which is an API. And increasingly, we're seeing most new apps being developed this way. And there is clearly a benefit to this where your front end can scale independently of your back end. Obviously, there's, sometimes a monolith is easier, sometimes using just Django and Ruby is easier, but we saw this trend and our users came to us and said, look, it's great that I can deploy a backend API on Render, but what I really want to do is also combine this with a static site on Render itself. I don't want to use a third-party provider. And so that is how we ended up with our static site offering, which is now actually one of the biggest drivers of our growth. So it's a lot of user feedback. It's a lot of sort of thinking through, say, newer features, even in Docker, like how you can run multiple build stages in parallel to make it faster to build a Docker image. So that's something that we saw. That's something that we want to put in place soon, and we have the technical ability to do it. Another example of something we want to do very soon is have render servers be in multiple regions, so that a user, if they want to run a multi-region app, they can simply click those regions and will automatically deploy their app in multiple regions. And this is becoming more interesting because people do want to set up apps that are geographically distributed. And then you have things like CockroachDB, which make it possible to run a global database that is relatively performant and gives you the features of something like Postgres. And so there is that data side of things, which is good. And now that makes certain apps possible that weren't possible before. But on the hosting side, it isn't as easy to set up the same app to run in multiple clusters. You have to spin up all these regions. You have to spin up VPCs in all these regions. You have to set up connections between them. And then you have to make sure your deploys are synchronized to some extent. And that is where, with Render, we can add a lot of value to these new trends and the new ways people are using the cloud.
Can you also talk about, what kind of tools or do you offer to developers so that they can comfortably work with that? Also, sometimes they mix a lot of things, so that it's easier for them to bring whatever they want to use.
From the beginning of Render, we have always had this principle of never being prescriptive about how you develop your app. So you don't have to program to, say, AWS's Lambda API or some proprietary Render API. You can program in any language. And if you can package your app as a Docker app, then you can run pretty much anything on Render. But even for people who don't want to use Docker, and people have good reasons for not wanting to use Docker, we have 6 native environments, and the number is growing, where we automatically pull your code in from GitHub, build it based on a single script that you might give us, or a one-line instruction like pip install requirements.txt. And then we make sure that whole thing is run as a container. So we're basically building, taking the source and deploying it as a container all automatically without the developer having to think about Docker at all.
So now I have some basics about Render. Anything else that you would like to touch upon? I do have one more question that is regarding this ongoing crisis that we are all facing. But and that would be my kind of wrap up last question. But is there anything else you would like to touch upon?
Render and all our growth, and we're now serving over 1 billion requests every month, well over 1 billion requests every month. And all of that has been driven by some of the macro trends in how people develop apps. And we're also seeing this because more and more apps are being developed by people who do not have access to large DevOps teams. And even larger companies do often find it very hard to hire good DevOps engineers. And in essence, Render is the DevOps team that you can either not afford or don't want to have.
We have to look at this current crisis that is going on, which has kind of, which has made, IT teams, decision makers to rethink how they build infrastructure. We used to talk about digital transformation and cloud, and suddenly that has become an urgency. If you're not on cloud, you would not survive this crisis. And if you look at the trends, this is going to take 2 or 3 years. We don't know how long it's going to take for us to recover from it. So what kind of trends have you seen? There has been a spike we don't have much time to actually go back and analyze, but within, this time frame that you have seen, which you think will set new norms once we are past this crisis?
There's obviously the broader industry trends where I think more and more people are going to be working remotely. I'm already seeing certain startups just say, look, from now on, we're entirely remote. We're giving up our office. We don't need to be in the office. So there are those sort of macro trends in terms of how we work. And obviously, there will be an explosion of tools that help people work remotely. So we're seeing the growth of Zoom. We're seeing the growth of Slack and Google Meet and Hangouts and all of those things. I think for Render specifically, we have seen our traffic more or less double through the crisis, which is really interesting because it's not because a lot of people are building all these COVID-focused sites that are hosted on Render, even though people are building COVID-focused sites that are hosted on Render, most of the traffic that we're seeing is coming from spikes in existing users' traffic. So that's pretty interesting to us, and we'll see how secular that trend is. But like you said, more people are moving to the cloud, and especially when you want to move to the cloud quickly and you want to get stuff out there quickly without spending a lot of money on DevOps people, and especially in a recession where you don't have the money to spend on engineers and DevOps engineers specifically as much, tools like Render will become more popular because they allow people to do more with less. And so similarly, I think tools that are no code or low code will continue to grow in popularity because there aren't enough engineers to go around, and people still want to do more things online.
Anurag, thank you for taking time out and talking to me about Render, also some of the trends that you're seeing, and also, what problems developers are facing and how you try to help and solve them. I look forward to seeing you in person at some point. I don't know when that will happen, but let's catch up again to see what things are going on there at Render. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was great.